It was a Tuesday morning in late September when Tom Reynolds woke up before dawn, just like he had done for the past 30 years on his ranch in South Texas. The alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 in the morning, the same time it had been set to since he first inherited this land from his father back in 1994. Tom groaned slightly as he swung his legs out of bed, his knees reminding him that he wasn't the young man who used to work these fields anymore. At 52 years old, he had the weathered skin and calloused hands of someone who had spent their entire life working under the Texas sun. The air was crisp and cool, a welcome relief from the scorching heat that had dominated the past few months. The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to paint the sky in magnificent shades of orange and pink, creating a watercolor canvas that stretched across the horizon. Tom walked to his kitchen window and looked out at his property, 1,500 acres of mixed terrain that included pastures for his cattle, patches of dense brush, and areas where the land gradually transitioned into the wild, untamed wilderness of the Rio Grande Valley. Duke, his 7-year-old German shepherd, was already waiting by the back door, tail wagging with eager anticipation. Duke had been Tom's constant companion since he was just a puppy, a gift from Tom's daughter Sarah when she went off to college in Austin. The dog had grown into a magnificent animal, loyal and intelligent, with a coat of black and tan fur that shimmered in the morning light. Duke knew the routine as well as Tom did. Every Tuesday and Friday, they would patrol the fence lines, check for breaks or damage, and make sure everything was secure. Tom grabbed his worn leather hat from the hook by the door, the same hat his father had worn decades ago. He picked up his sturdy walking stick, a piece of mesquite wood that he had carved and smoothed himself over many evenings on the porch. He also took his work gloves, a bottle of water, and his old flip phone, not the fancy smartphone his daughter kept insisting he needed, but a simple device that worked well enough for the occasional call. He strapped on his belt with a small knife and a flashlight, standard equipment for anyone venturing into the borderlands where civilization met wilderness. As Tom and Duke headed out, the morning chorus of birds was beginning. Cardinals, mockingbirds, and doves called out their territorial songs. The air smelled fresh and clean, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers that had bloomed after the recent rains. It was the kind of morning that reminded Tom why he loved this life, despite its hardships and challenges. They walked along the main dirt road that cut through his property, Duke ranging ahead but never straying too far. The dog would occasionally stop to investigate an interesting scent or mark a tree, but he always kept Tom in sight. They passed the old windmill that had been there since Tom's grandfather's time, its blades creaking softly as they turned in the gentle breeze. They walked past the cattle pens, where his small herd of longhorns grazed peacefully, their distinctive horns catching the morning light. About 40 minutes into their walk, they reached the southern boundary of Tom's property. This was where his ranch ended, and the real wilderness began. Thousands of acres of protected land that formed part of a critical wildlife corridor stretching all the way down to Mexico. The fence here was older, requiring more frequent maintenance, and Tom had been meaning to reinforce several sections but hadn't gotten around to it yet. They were now about 2 miles from the ranch house, in an area thick with mesquite trees, prickly pear cactus, and dense brush. This was the wildest part of Tom's land, a place where he rarely brought his cattle because the terrain was too rough and the vegetation too thick. It was also the area most frequently visited by wildlife. White-tailed deer, javelinas, coyotes, and occasionally even mountain lions. Duke suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His body went rigid, his ears perked straight up, and a low rumbling growl emerged from deep in his chest. This wasn't his usual reaction to deer or the wild hogs that sometimes roamed through the area. Tom had been around Duke long enough to recognize that something was very different. Something was wrong. Tom held up his hand in a silent command for Duke to stay, and the dog obeyed, though every muscle in his body remained tense and alert. Tom stood perfectly still and listened carefully, filtering out the normal sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of a hawk, the buzzing of insects. That's when he heard it, faint at first, but growing clearer as he focused on it. It was a low, guttural sound that made the hair on the back of Tom's neck stand up. It was unlike anything he had heard before in all his years on this land. It was the sound of pain, of desperation, of a powerful animal in severe distress. The sound came in waves, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but always carrying that edge of primal suffering that transcended species barriers. Tom's mind raced through possibilities. Could it be a mountain lion caught in something? A large wild hog injured and dying? Whatever it was clearly a predator of significant size, and it was in trouble. His first instinct was to call for help, but when he pulled out his phone, he saw what he had expected. No signal. Out here, cell coverage was non-existent. He was on his own. Following the sound through thick brush and tangled mesquite trees, Tom moved slowly and carefully. Duke stayed close to his side now, whining softly with anxiety. They pushed through a particularly dense thicket, thorns catching on Tom's jacket and scratching at his arms. And then, as they emerged into a small clearing, Tom stopped so abruptly that Duke bumped into his legs. There, about 20 feet ahead of them, caught in a cruel wire snare that had been illegally set and attached to a thick oak tree, was a jaguar. Tom's breath caught in his throat. In all his years living on this land, in all the stories passed down from his father and grandfather, he had never seen a jaguar in person. He knew they existed. Scientists had documented a few males ranging up from Mexico into southern Arizona and Texas in recent years. But actually seeing one, especially this close, was something he never imagined would happen. The creature was absolutely magnificent. It was a large male, probably weighing close to 200 pounds, with a body that stretched about 6 feet from nose to tail. Its coat was a stunning golden yellow, covered in distinctive black rosettes that formed intricate patterns across its muscular frame. Each rosette was unique, like fingerprints, marking this animal as an individual in a species that had once been common throughout the American Southwest, but was now critically endangered in the United States. But what struck Tom most powerfully were the jaguar's eyes. They were a brilliant amber color, intense and intelligent, and in them, Tom could see a mixture of emotions that he wouldn't have thought possible in a wild animal. There was rage, certainly, and fear, but also exhaustion, pain, and something that looked almost like pleading. The wire snare had been set with cruel efficiency. It was a simple loop design, probably meant for deer or wild hogs, but it had caught something far more precious and rare. The loop had tightened around the jaguar's front left paw, and the animal's struggles to escape had only made it worse. The wire had cut deep into flesh, past the fur and into the tissue beneath. Blood had pooled on the ground beneath the jaguar, dark and wet, and Tom could see that the animal had been there for hours, maybe even since the previous night. The jaguar was lying down now, its energy clearly depleted from hours of fighting against the snare. But when it saw Tom and Duke emerge from the brush, it tried to rise, tried to appear threatening despite its compromised position. A deep growl rumbled from its chest, and it bared its impressive teeth, each one designed for tearing flesh and crushing bone. Tom knew that jaguars had the strongest bite force of any big cat, pound for pound. They were capable of biting through turtle shells, crushing the skulls of cattle, and killing their prey with a single bite to the skull, a hunting method unique among big cats. Duke growled back instinctively, but Tom quieted him with a gentle hand on the dog's head. They all stood there for a moment, frozen in a tableau that seemed to exist outside of normal time, man, dog, and jaguar, each assessing the others, each uncertain of what would happen next. Tom's first rational thought was to back away slowly, leave the area, and try to find help. He could drive to the nearest town, try to reach the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or maybe the local game warden. But even as he thought this, he realized the problems with that plan. The nearest town was 30 miles away. His truck was back at the ranch house, which meant at least an hour round trip just to get there and back. Then he would need to actually reach someone, explain the situation, and convince them it was real and urgent. Best case scenario, help would arrive in 3 or 4 hours. More likely it would be longer. He looked at the blood on the ground, at the jaguar's labored breathing, at the way the animal's eyes were beginning to glaze slightly with shock and exhaustion. 3 or 4 hours might as well be an eternity. The jaguar would likely die from blood loss, shock, or a combination of both long before any official rescue team could arrive. Tom felt something shift deep inside him. He had always been a practical man, someone who believed in following rules and doing things the proper way. But he was also someone who had spent his entire life on this land, who understood in his bones that every creature had a right to exist. and that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the safe thing or the prescribed thing. The snare itself was illegal, probably set by poachers who didn't care about endangered species protection laws or federal regulations. These people would sneak onto properties in the borderlands, set their traps and return later to collect whatever they had caught. They sold everything: deer meat to game markets, wild hog to restaurants, even body parts of endangered species to black market collectors. Tom had reported suspicious activity to the authorities several times over the years, but enforcement was difficult in these remote areas. Looking at this suffering animal, this rare and magnificent creature that represented one of the last remnants of what the American wilderness used to be, Tom couldn't just walk away. He wouldn't. His father had taught him that with land ownership came responsibility, not just to manage the property, but to be a steward of all life that depended on it. Duke whined softly beside him, pressing against his leg as if sensing the weight of the decision his owner was making. Tom took a deep breath, pulled out his phone one more time to confirm there was still no signal, and made a decision that many people would later call crazy, reckless, and even suicidal. He was going to free the jaguar himself. Tom began talking in a low, calm voice, the same tone he used when working with nervous horses or frightened cattle. He told the jaguar what he was going to do, knowing the animal couldn't understand his words, but hoping that perhaps his tone and intention might communicate something on a deeper level. He explained that he meant no harm, that he was there to help, that he needed the jaguar to trust him just for a few minutes. The jaguar's ears twitched as Tom spoke, and for brief moments the deep growling would subside. It was a small sign, but Tom took it as encouragement. He instructed Duke to stay back, pointing to a spot about 15 feet away. The dog obeyed reluctantly, settling into a sitting position but remaining alert and ready to defend his owner if necessary. Tom slowly approached the jaguar, moving with deliberate, non-threatening motions. Every step took extraordinary courage. He was walking toward one of the most powerful predators in the Americas, an animal perfectly designed by evolution to kill, and he was doing it without any real protection or weapon. The small knife on his belt would be useless against a full-grown jaguar. If this animal decided to attack, Tom would have no real defense. When he was about 10 feet away, the jaguar suddenly lunged toward him as far as the snare would allow. The movement was explosive and terrifying. The big cat's jaws snapped together with a sound like a gunshot, just inches from where Tom's arm had been a split second before. Tom stumbled backward, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. Duke barked furiously, torn between his training to stay and his instinct to protect his owner. Tom stood there for a moment, breathing hard, reconsidering his entire plan. This was insane. This was how people died in the wilderness, he thought. But when he looked at the jaguar again, he saw that the lunge had cost the animal dearly. It was now panting heavily, and fresh blood was seeping from the wound where the wire had cut even deeper. The jaguar's eyes were pleading now, the brief burst of aggressive energy clearly having exhausted its remaining reserves. Tom spoke again, his voice shaky but steady. He told the jaguar he understood that it was scared, that it was in pain, that every instinct was telling it to fight or flee. But he also told it that he was its only chance, that without help it would die in this clearing, alone and suffering. As ridiculous as it seemed to be having a one-sided conversation with a wild animal, Tom felt it was necessary, as much for his own courage as for any calming effect it might have on the jaguar. Using his walking stick, Tom carefully examined the snare mechanism from a safer distance. It was a wire cable loop attached to a spring-loaded mechanism anchored to the tree. The loop was designed to tighten when the animal pulled against it, and the more the jaguar had struggled, the tighter it had become. To release it, Tom would need to manually loosen the cable, which meant getting his hands right next to those powerful jaws and razor-sharp claws. Tom formed a plan. He removed his heavy work jacket, the thick denim material reinforced with canvas patches. It wouldn't stop a determined jaguar bite, but it might provide a crucial second of protection. He also grabbed a length of rope from his belt that he used for various ranch tasks. His idea was to use the jacket as a shield and distraction while working on the snare with his other hand. He approached again, even more slowly this time, talking constantly in that low, soothing voice. The jaguar watched him with those intense amber eyes, its body tense but no longer making aggressive moves. Tom wondered if the animal was simply too exhausted to fight anymore, or if on some level it truly understood that Tom was trying to help. When Tom was finally close enough to reach the snare, he could smell the jaguar, a wild, musky scent mixed with the metallic odor of blood. He could see the incredible details of the animal's face up close, the white spots above each eye that looked almost like eyebrows, the distinctive pattern of spots on the muzzle, the long white whiskers, and those eyes that seemed far too intelligent and aware for comfort. Tom positioned his jacket-wrapped left arm between himself and the jaguar's head, while he reached for the snare mechanism with his right hand. His fingers were shaking so badly that he could barely manipulate the wire. The blood made everything slippery, and he had to wipe his hand on his pants several times to get enough grip. The jaguar suddenly swatted at him with its free front paw, claws extended like curved daggers. The blow caught Tom's jacket-wrapped arm, and even through the thick material, he felt the power behind it. 4 lines of fire erupted across his forearm where the claws had penetrated the fabric. Tom gasped in pain, but forced himself to keep working on the snare. Minutes felt like hours. Sweat poured down Tom's face despite the cool morning air, mixing with the dust and blood that now covered his hands. Duke whined anxiously from his position, clearly distressed by his owner's proximity to such danger. Birds that had been singing earlier had fallen silent, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, watching this improbable scene unfold. Tom's fingers found the locking mechanism of the snare. It was stiff, corroded slightly from exposure to the elements, but he could feel it giving way slowly under his manipulation. The jaguar was watching his every movement now, its head so close that Tom could feel the animal's breath on his arm. Those massive jaws could open and close on Tom's limb in a fraction of a second, and there would be nothing he could do about it. And then, finally, mercifully, Tom felt the wire loop give way. With one last manipulation, applying pressure in just the right direction, the cable loosened. The jaguar immediately felt the change in tension and pulled its injured paw free from the now slack loop. What happened in the next few seconds would be burned into Tom's memory for the rest of his life, replayed in his mind thousands of times, analyzed and reanalyzed, but never fully understood. The moment the jaguar's paw was free, every rational part of Tom's brain screamed at him to run, to get away as fast as possible. The animal was no longer trapped. Tom was right there, vulnerable, exhausted from the effort and the adrenaline, an easy target for a predator that he had just been handling roughly for the past several minutes. Even if the jaguar wasn't aggressive by nature, even if it didn't see humans as prey, it was injured, frightened, and pumped full of stress hormones. An attack would be completely understandable, almost expected. But the jaguar didn't attack. Instead, the big cat took 2 steps backward, putting some distance between itself and Tom. Then it simply stood there, favoring its injured paw but standing nonetheless, and stared directly at Tom with those penetrating amber eyes. For a long moment, Tom later estimated it was probably only 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Man and beast locked eyes in direct, unflinching contact. There was no growl, no aggressive posture, no preparation to pounce. The jaguar's tail hung low and relaxed. Its ears were forward and alert, but not flattened back in anger or fear. It was just looking at Tom, studying him, evaluating him. Tom found himself unable to look away, caught in a moment that felt almost spiritual in its intensity. In those eyes, he saw something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between human and animal consciousness. There was intelligence there, certainly, but also something more, a depth of awareness, of presence, that seemed to acknowledge what had just transpired between them. It was as if the jaguar understood, not in the way a human would understand, with words and complex reasoning, but in some more fundamental way. The animal seemed to recognize that Tom had helped it, that the pain and restriction were gone because of this strange 2-legged creature's actions. There was no aggression in that gaze, no fear either. Just a profound moment of mutual recognition between 2 living beings who had just shared something extraordinary. Tom later struggled to describe this moment to anyone who asked. The closest he could come was to say it felt like the jaguar was saying thank you, but that phrase seemed too human, too loaded with our own concepts of gratitude and social obligation. It was more primal than that, more honest. It was acknowledgement. It, pure and simple. An acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged in those intense minutes when Tom had chosen compassion over fear. Then, without warning, the jaguar turned and began moving into the thick brush. Despite its injured paw, the animal moved with surprising grace and fluidity. Tom watched as the distinctive spotted coat blended with the dappled shadows of the forest. Within seconds, the jaguar had disappeared completely, as silently and ghost-like as mist evaporating in morning sunshine. If not for the blood on the ground, the sprung snare, and the claw marks on his jacket, Tom might have thought he had imagined the entire encounter. Tom stood there for a long moment, his heart still pounding, his hands still shaking with residual adrenaline. Duke cautiously approached and licked his owner's hand, whining softly as if asking if everything was okay. Tom reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, suddenly overwhelmed with emotion, relief that he was alive and uninjured beyond some scratches, awe at what had just happened, and a deep, profound sense of having participated in something meaningful. He looked at his scratched arm, which was bleeding slightly but not seriously. The wounds would need cleaning and bandaging, but they weren't deep. He looked at the snare, at the blood staining the ground, at the tracks leading into the brush where the jaguar had vanished. He took several photographs with his phone, both of the snare and of the scene, knowing he would need evidence of what had occurred. The walk back to the ranch house seemed to take forever. Tom's legs felt weak, his mind racing with everything that had happened. He kept replaying the moment when he and the jaguar had locked eyes, trying to understand what he had felt, what had passed between them. Duke stayed close, occasionally looking up at his owner with concerned eyes. When they finally reached the ranch house, it was still only 9 in the morning. The entire encounter, from finding the jaguar to freeing it and walking back, had taken less than 3 hours. Tom's daughter Sarah wouldn't believe how much his world had changed in such a short time. After cleaning and bandaging his arm, Tom tried his landline and was relieved to get a dial tone. He called the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service office in Corpus Christi, something he had looked up years ago when he first heard reports of jaguars returning to Texas. The person who answered seemed skeptical at first. Jaguar sightings were rare enough, but someone actually encountering one at close range and living to tell about it was almost unheard of. Tom patiently explained what had happened, provided his location and credentials as a long-time landowner, and offered to send the photographs he had taken. His sincerity and the level of detail in his description eventually convinced the agent that this was legitimate. She told him that a team would be sent out to document the snare, collect any evidence for prosecution of the poachers, and try to set up camera traps in the area to monitor the jaguar's movements and condition. 2 days later, a team of 3 wildlife biologists and a federal agent arrived at Tom's ranch. He guided them to the location where the incident had occurred. They were impressed by Tom's photographs and his detailed account of the encounter. They carefully documented the snare, collected it as evidence, and set up several motion-activated trail cameras in the surrounding area. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the lead biologist, was particularly interested in Tom's description of the jaguar's behavior after being freed. She explained that jaguars, unlike some other big cats, had very rarely been known to attack humans. There were only a handful of documented cases in all of North and South America, and most of those involved animals that were cornered or protecting cubs. Still, she said, what Tom had done was extraordinarily dangerous and should never be attempted again. But she also said something that stuck with Tom. She told him that his actions had likely saved the life of one of the most critically endangered animals in the United States. With fewer than a dozen jaguars known to be ranging north of the Mexican border, every individual was precious beyond measure. They represented the hope that these magnificent animals might one day re-establish populations in their former range across the American Southwest. The team stayed in the area for 3 days, checking their cameras and looking for signs of the jaguar. On the second day, they found tracks indicating that the animal was moving relatively normally, suggesting the paw injury was healing without serious infection. They also found evidence that the jaguar had made a kill, the remains of a javelina that had been dragged into thick brush and partially consumed. This was an excellent sign that the animal was recovering and able to hunt effectively. Before they left, Dr. Martinez asked Tom if he would be willing to allow the Wildlife Service to maintain the trail cameras on his property permanently. The data they could gather about jaguar movements and behavior in Texas would be invaluable for conservation efforts. Tom agreed without hesitation. She also told him that they would be referring the case of the illegal snare to federal prosecutors, and that poaching of endangered species carried serious penalties, including heavy fines and prison time. Life returned to something resembling normal on the Reynolds Ranch after that. Tom continued his daily routines, tending to his cattle, maintaining his fences, and patrolling his land with Duke. But something fundamental had changed. He found himself looking at the wilderness that bordered his property differently now. It wasn't just empty land or a buffer zone anymore. It was home to creatures that had as much right to be there as he did, creatures whose existence added something irreplaceable to the world. He thought about the jaguar every day. He wondered where it was, whether its paw had fully healed, whether it was finding enough prey in the tough borderland environment. At night, he sometimes dreamed about those amber eyes staring into his, about that moment of connection that transcended the normal boundaries between human and wild animal. 3 weeks and 4 days after the rescue, on a cool October evening, something extraordinary happened that would provide the final chapter to this remarkable story. Tom was sitting on his porch, which wrapped around the front and side of his ranch house. He had a cold beer in one hand and was watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange, red, and purple. Duke was at his feet, dozing contentedly after a long day of following Tom around the property. The evening was peaceful, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage and the distant lowing of cattle settling down for the night. Duke's head suddenly lifted, his ears perking up. But unlike the morning when they had found the jaguar, the dog didn't growl or show any signs of aggression. Instead, his tail began to wag slowly, and he made a soft whuffing sound that Tom had never heard before. It was almost like the dog was greeting an old friend. Tom followed Duke's gaze toward the tree line at the edge of his property, about 50 yards from the house. The shadows were growing long as the sun sank toward the horizon, making it difficult to see clearly into the darker areas where the forest began. But as Tom's eyes adjusted, he saw movement. A large shape emerged partially from the shadows, stopping just at the edge of where the cleared land met the wilderness. Even at this distance, even in the fading light, Tom recognized the distinctive spotted coat and powerful build immediately. It was the jaguar. The animal was standing broadside to the house, clearly visible but not approaching any closer. Tom could see that it was moving normally on all 4 paws. No limp, no sign of injury. The paw had healed completely. The jaguar turned its head toward the porch, toward Tom. And even from 50 yards away, Tom felt the intensity of that gaze. Tom stood up slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. Duke stood too, but made no move to leave the porch. They all stayed like that for several minutes, frozen in a tableau that seemed to exist outside of normal time. The jaguar at the forest's edge, the man on his porch, and the dog between them, all connected by something that had happened 3 weeks earlier. Tom felt his throat tighten with emotion. He had wondered if he would ever see the jaguar again, had assumed that their paths would never cross a second time. The borderlands were vast, and jaguars were solitary animals with territories that could span hundreds of square miles. The chances of this particular animal returning to this specific location were astronomically small. And yet, here it was. Tom raised his hand slowly in a gesture that he couldn't explain, part wave, part acknowledgement, part blessing. And then, in a movement that Tom would replay in his mind for the rest of his life, the jaguar dipped its head slightly, almost like a nod, before turning and walking back into the forest. The movement was deliberate and unhurried. This wasn't an animal fleeing in fear or departing out of caution. It was the exit of a creature that had come for a specific purpose and, having accomplished it, was now moving on. Within seconds, the jaguar had melted back into the shadows and was gone. Tom sat back down heavily in his chair, his hand shaking as he set down his beer. Duke whined softly and pushed his head under Tom's hand, seeking reassurance or perhaps offering it. They sat like that for a long time, man and dog, watching the tree line as darkness fell completely and the first stars began to appear in the deepening blue of the evening sky. Tom never saw the jaguar again after that evening, and part of him was grateful for that. The two encounters they'd had were perfect bookends to a story that didn't need any additional chapters. The first meeting had been about survival and compassion, about one living being helping another in desperate need. The second meeting had been about something more difficult to define, acknowledgement perhaps, or closure. It was as if the Jaguar had wanted Tom to know that it was okay, that it had survived and thrived, and that what Tom had done had mattered. In the weeks and months that followed, the trail cameras that Dr. Martinez's team had set up captured dozens of images of the Jaguar. The biologists named him El Rey, which means the king in Spanish, both for his majestic appearance and for his survival against all odds. The cameras showed him hunting successfully, marking his territory and moving confidently through the borderlands. His injured paw showed no signs of long-term damage. Tom's story spread through the conservation community and eventually made its way to local and then national news. He was uncomfortable with the attention at first, worried that people would think he was reckless or that they would come looking for the Jaguar. But Dr. Martinez convinced him that his story was important to share because it demonstrated something crucial: that humans and wildlife could coexist, that compassion could bridge the gap between civilization and wilderness, and that sometimes the wildest creatures could teach us the most profound lessons about courage and kindness. The publicity had some positive effects. Funding increased for jaguar conservation efforts in the borderlands. More landowners came forward, offering to allow wildlife cameras and monitoring on their properties. Several other illegal snares were found and removed from the region, and 2 poachers were eventually arrested and prosecuted. The case of El Rey became a symbol of hope for conservationists working to protect jaguars and other endangered species. Tom continued his life on the ranch, but he saw his role differently now. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was a steward of land that served as a critical corridor for some of North America's most imperiled wildlife. He began working more closely with conservation organizations, attending meetings about wildlife corridors and habitat protection, and speaking to school groups about the importance of preserving wild spaces. His daughter, Sarah, who had always been passionate about environmental issues, was inspired by her father's experience to change her major at the University of Texas from business to wildlife biology. She went on to join Dr. Martinez's team after graduation, working specifically on jaguar conservation in the borderlands. She would sometimes joke that it took her father getting clawed by a jaguar for her to figure out what she wanted to do with her life. Duke remained Tom's constant companion, continuing their regular patrols around the property. Tom sometimes wondered if the dog remembered their encounter with El Rey, if he could still recall that moment of tension and danger, followed by the profound peace of the jaguar's final departure. The dog would sometimes stop and stare at the tree line, his tail wagging slowly, as if remembering something important. 5 years after the rescue, on the anniversary of that September morning, Tom walked back to the spot where he had found El Rey trapped in the snare. The tree was still there, though the area where the snare had been attached bore only a faint scar in the bark. The clearing looked peaceful in the morning light, with wildflowers blooming and butterflies dancing through the air. It was hard to imagine the scene of blood and desperation that had once unfolded here. Tom stood there for a while, remembering every detail of that morning: the fear, the adrenaline, the moment of decision when he chose to help rather than walk away, and most of all, the eyes of the jaguar staring into his with what he could only interpret as gratitude and understanding. He thought about how that one morning had changed the trajectory of his life, had given him a deeper sense of purpose, and had connected him to something larger than himself. A motion-activated camera mounted on a nearby tree captured Tom's visit to the clearing that day. Later, when the Wildlife Service technicians collected the SD card from that camera, they found something remarkable. Just 4 hours after Tom had left the clearing, another image was recorded. It showed El Rey, now fully grown and in his prime, walking through that same clearing. The jaguar had paused in the exact spot where Tom had stood, and the camera had caught a perfect profile shot of the magnificent animal. Dr. Martinez called Tom when she saw the image. She told him that El Rey was now estimated to be around 10 years old and was one of the most frequently photographed jaguars in their monitoring network. He had a territory that spanned nearly 200 square miles, including Tom's ranch and the surrounding protected lands. He was healthy, successfully hunting prey, and showing all the signs of a thriving apex predator. More remarkably, genetic analysis from hair samples collected near the cameras suggested that El Rey had encountered and possibly mated with at least one female jaguar that had ranged up from Mexico. If confirmed, this would mean that breeding jaguars had returned to Texas for the first time in decades, a conservation milestone that few had thought possible even 10 years earlier. Tom likes to think that El Rey's cubs, if they exist, carry forward not just the jaguar's genes, but also the memory of that September morning. He knows that's probably too poetic, too anthropomorphic, that wild animals don't think about such things, but still, on quiet evenings when he sits on his porch and looks toward the tree line, he allows himself to imagine it. He imagines El Rey somewhere in the vast borderlands, teaching his cubs to hunt, showing them the boundaries of their territory, passing on the skills and instincts that have allowed jaguars to survive for millions of years. And maybe, just maybe, in whatever way that jaguars understand such things, passing on the knowledge that not all humans are threats, that sometimes the two-legged creatures can be allies rather than enemies. Today, Tom is 57 years old. His hair has gone grey and his knees complain more loudly about the long walks around the property. Duke is 12 now, slowing down but still making the rounds with Tom every Tuesday and Friday. Sarah works full-time for the conservation program and visits the ranch often, usually bringing colleagues who want to see the land where the famous rescue occurred. The story of Tom and El Rey has become part of the cultural fabric of the borderlands, told and retold in schools, conservation meetings, and around campfires. Some people embellish it, adding details that weren't there. Others are skeptical, thinking it must have been exaggerated over time. But those who know Tom, who have seen the scars on his arm and the photographs he took that morning, know that every word of his account is true. For Tom, the experience taught him something fundamental about courage, compassion, and the unexpected connections that can form between even the most unlikely of creatures. It taught him that fear is not always the appropriate response to danger, that sometimes the right choice is also the dangerous choice, and that moments of profound meaning can arise in the most unexpected circumstances. Most importantly, it taught him that the wild animals we share this planet with are not just resources to be managed or threats to be controlled. They are fellow travelers on this earth, deserving of respect, space, and compassion. They have their own dignity, their own consciousness, and their own right to exist. And when we choose to honor that, when we extend a hand in help rather than harm, something magical can happen. The wilderness continues on, vast and mysterious just beyond the fence line of Tom Reynolds' ranch. Jaguars still roam through the borderlands, though they remain rare and elusive. Conservation efforts continue, balancing the needs of wildlife with the livelihoods of ranchers and the security concerns of a border region. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sunset paints the sky in brilliant colors and the first stars begin to appear, Tom sits on his porch with Duke at his feet, looks toward the tree line, and remembers. He remembers the weight of a life in his hands, the amber eyes that soar into his soul, and the profound truth that in choosing compassion over fear, we don't just save other creatures. We save something essential in ourselves,